Good afternoon, everyone. I call to order the January 9th, 2023 tax budget hearing of the Cincinnati Public School Board. We welcome everyone and request everyone in the audience to silence your cell phones and electronic devices. Ms. Wagner, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bolton? Present. Mr. Craig?
Here.
Ms. Jones?
Here.
Dr. Moffitt?
Here.
Mr. Morosky?
Here.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Here.
President Lindy?
Here. There may be members of the public online who would like to speak during the hearing of the public section of the budget hearing. And if there are folks who are online who would like to do so, please indicate your interest in speaking by clicking the chat button now. The chat feature will remain open for your requests for 5 minutes. Please submit your name, your affiliation, your school community, your topic, and your contact information if you would like a direct response to any questions. As we get started, I just want to welcome everyone and share that it's an unusual evening, the first meeting in January. We actually have 3 different meetings tonight, and we've just started the first of them. We're going to have our tax budget hearing, and you'll get more context on what that is in just a moment. It'll be followed by our organizational meeting, which will be followed by our business meeting. So with that, I'd like to invite either our treasurer or Kevin to share a bit about our tax budget hearing.
Thank you, President Lindy. So tonight we're going to have Mr. Ashley as our Director of Financial Transparency and Reporting and is responsible for the development of the tax budget. And he's going to be presenting tonight. So have at it, Kevin. Thank you.
Good evening. It's good to see you guys today. So in your package, you received a full tax budget report that will be submitted to Hamilton County Budget Commission once you guys approve that later in the regular meeting. But what I wanted to go over today is just a short PowerPoint to kind of give you an overview of what's included in that report. So Rob, if you could go to the next slide. The purpose of the tax budget is it's prepared in response to requirements of the Ohio Revised Code, and it conforms with reporting requirements provided by the county audit, the Hamilton County Auditor. They do allow us to do what's called a modified report. And so that's what the report is under that format. School districts must prepare a tax budget each January to provide a basis for the Hamilton County Budget Commission's review of the next calendar year's local property tax rates, millage of those rates. Next slide, please. So part of that, what we include is a debt summary. And what this shows is what the current outstanding debt, the column on the far column on the right, shows the balance as of 1/1/24. So basically a year from now. And just to give you an idea of the categories there, the voted bond levy related back to the facilities master plan for building projects that was approved by the voters in November of 2002. So the original debt there was $480 million. Currently, the balance, well, as of 1/1/24, will be $193.4 million. There's several categories of unvoted debt that are listed out there. Qualified school construction bonds, which were basically used for energy conservation projects, and that affected about 40 buildings. And those were all started between 2010, 2012. The next category is limited tax general obligation bonds from 2018, and that was basically a refunding of some of the earlier debt going back to 2002, and that affected about 15 different school projects. The next category, actually certificates of participation, which are our more recent debt issuances, are essentially like lease purchase agreements and have allowed us to do building improvements or purchase property, in this first case here, Mercy, or the Clifton Area Neighborhood Schools Project. And then the last category is 3 separate certificates of participation issues. The 2021 was a a refunding of earlier debt. The three categories listed there at the bottom are funded through the original stadium project that currently receives money from Hamilton County. Previously, the city of Cincinnati was party to that too, but their portion of that has now ended. So there's a lot of information in one slide, but just to give you an overview, I hope that was a brief enough overview. The next slide is some specifics of the tax budget, what is required. Next slide, please. General fund revenues. So these are derived from the most recent 5-year forecast that was approved back in November. The county has now gotten property values certified through the Ohio Department of Taxation. So those have been incorporated to determine what we now anticipate the revenues to be. Not a big difference, just some slight differences. Also, if there had been any tax rate updates, which I don't believe there were any from that time to now. We do not present general fund expenditures. However, we do provide them with the 5-year forecast, and they have all of that information as well. The other thing is the bond fund that has the voted levy in it. We are required to present the revenues, estimated revenues, and estimated expenditures for that part of the debt service fund. Next slide. So in terms of the voted debt, showing here, like I said, a high level revenues versus expenditures. You can see for calendar year. Another thing we do with a tax budget is we have to break it down into a calendar year versus the fiscal year because the taxes are levied based on a calendar year versus us operating on the fiscal year. Next slide, please. So supplementary information that we provide relates to our other debt. We basically take this opportunity to go over all of our debt so that you're aware of that. The unvoted debt portion is not required to be part of the tax budget. But again, we just want to, in full transparency, present that here. One of the things I did want to note here, a footnote, we included the estimated revenues versus expenditures, and we show that the expenditures will exceed the revenue slightly in 23, but the other way in 24. There is very adequate balance in that fund to cover that, so that I just wanted to footnote that there as well. And I think that's all I have as far as the presentation, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Kevin, thank you very much for your presentation. It seemed very, very helpful to me. Treasurer Wagner, is there anything you want to add?
Only in that this is a annual requirement that all 613 school districts have to do. And in Hamilton County, they use it to certify, excuse me, the estimated millage for all the property taxes and to make sure that we're bringing in enough revenue, excuse me, to pay that debt, the bonded levy. And the information shows that we do. Excuse me. So you're required to pass it through a resolution. And Kevin said it was in the next meeting, but I think it's actually next on the agenda.
Sounds good. Thanks, Treasurer Wagner. Board members, any questions about the presentation on the tax budget? Thank you, Kevin. We appreciate it. Ms. Bolton.
Thank you. Thank you. Couple of questions. I know this hearing that we're holding is, I think, maybe the only one or
Thanks, Julie.
one of a few that's required by the state to hold regarding finances within the district. I remember being tutored very specifically about that by Kathy Ingram, that this had to be a kind of a public hearing. I have a question on the facilities master plan. We usually tell and remind the public that the facilities master plan cost $1.2 billion. And yet on here, the number seems lower. Could you explain the difference, Madam Treasurer?
Yes, absolutely. So you're right. The facility master plan was over $1 billion. The state would only, because of our wealth factor, provide 27 or 29% of the funding, and so that our public had to make up the difference, and that's the $480 million and some of the other debt, the conservation energy bonds allowed us to finish off the rest of our projects.
And from the facilities master plan piece, as I recall, there was a facilities master plan plus, which maybe you're referencing by talking in terms of the energy piece, but we added a number, I don't know, 4 or 5 or so more schools after the facilities master plan was completed. Could you speak to that and how we funded that? Because I think that's very important.
So when we began the facility master plan is when the inception of community schools started. And we saw a pretty dramatic, within a 3-year period, drop in enrollment. And the state demographers insisted that our projection student enrollment would drop down to 28,000 students. So they forced us to close a bunch of buildings and take projects out of our plan. And we fought with them over and over again. And I love saying that I proved ourselves right, because we're now close to 36,000 students rather than 28,000. And so we had to find ways to add buildings back into the population of the district. And so most recently, the COPS issue that Kevin referred to, we were able to add renovate bring back cans into the building, into the district, and buy the Mercy building for Gamble Montessori High School. We also renovated Hyde Park, had been cut out of the plan. Leap had been cut out of the plan. Carthage, maybe, I think. I'm going off of years of memory here. But so we were able to bring those back into the plan through alternate funding sources, through the Q-Scoobies and the COPS issues.
If also, as the public looks at unvoted, can you explain a little bit more about that, which is, I think, important to explain?
Right. So the voted debt goes onto a ballot and goes through an election for the public to vote on. That was the bond levy, $480 million. And we've paid down at least half of it now. Unvoted debt means we don't have to go to the public for approval, that we can arrange for borrowings in other ways. Some of it qualifies and goes against our debt ceilings, and some of it doesn't. Like the COPS issues, they act more like capital leases, and so they're not considered official debt, even though we're obligated to make that payment. So we budget for those payments, and it's a way to do that, so that because we had the $48 million sitting on the books, we couldn't continue. You have a limit on how much money you can borrow as a district, and the $480 million levy put us at that limit. So we had to get creative on other funding sources to make those things happen.
If I could, appreciate it. If we could think in terms of the things that the district needs as a result of the work of particularly ad hoc or some of the ideas that the superintendent has espoused, and if we needed more facilities monies, what kinds of monies to either purchase or rent or what have you, do we have a range of the amount of money that we're allowed to still try to put ourselves in debt?
The calculation changes every year, because the more we pay off debt, the more room we have to borrow more. But that we do have a limit, a ceiling on debt. So we'd have to do an analysis, but there are different opportunities. We can always, as a district, go to the public for a PI levy, a permanent improvement levy, or another bond levy, given that we can fit it into the ceiling. But then we'd have to go through mathematical calculation based on what we think we need. I don't know that off the top of my head. The last time we looked at it, we only had about $7 million worth of unvoted debt that we could take on. I'm sorry, voted space in the debt that we could take on against the ceiling, but that was 3 or 4 years ago.
Would you anticipate that that's more now or less?
I would anticipate it's more, because the property values have gone up, and we've paid down debt, so there should be a little bit more room, but I wouldn't say enough to buy or build a school building.
So that would be what we could do regarding unvoted or voted?
It depends on the debt instrument.
voted would be directly tied to an issue in a project, where the unvoted is more of a district decision. And then, as she mentioned, the COPS issues don't fall under the debt ceiling.
And then whether voted or unvoted, that would, it would have to be limited to what we stated to the public or to the financiers, what we were going to use it for. That doesn't necessarily flow back into general fund.
No, it cannot flow into the general fund. It keeps its own set of books. So we'd have to get bond counsel involved in this conversation at some point. But most of the projects that we've done, as I was the treasurer, we have very specific projects like the Cairns project and the Mercy project that we did. We're using ESSER funds to help expand Walnut Hills, Hyde Park, and Pleasant Ridge. And so we're trying to get creative with and use the funds most effectively to help us move forward.
I would just, if I might last comment, I would suggest that looking at where we are regarding our own general fund budget and sort of the vision that's developing, it would seem to me that we would need to be, and I think you already are, in consultation, I would assume, with our bond folks and our legal folks regarding the possibility of having that as additional revenue to pursue. And we would need to know that somewhat sooner than later to be able to make some decisions about how we might use general fund dollars. Is that an appropriate assumption or conclusion?
Sure.
I want a real answer, not sure.
We need to have a deeper conversation about specifics, but yes, we will do what we need to do to support the strategies of the district.
And then
Ms. Bolton, do you have a project in mind?
I have many.
I thought there might be one or two.
And as the person that was here when we were closing more than 12.5 schools and adding and fighting for enrollment with the state, I think we all probably have some important projects regarding the growth of the district or the changing or evolving of the district. So appreciate the comments. The only other thing I'd say is that this would be for property and facilities. Can you use bonds or any other of these creative measures for anything else? Like transportation.
Buying buses.
Yes. Because right now, if we'd acted when we first mentioned that, not me, but others, we would have at least 15 vans ready to roll next year.
We could use a permanent improvement levy to do buses.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Vice President Jones.
Yeah, I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'm asked it anyway, and it's sort of as a follow-up. I call it tailgating the 25 questions that Ms. Bolton just asked you, which totally appropriate. I get it. So currently, we talked about, Ms. Bolton talked about some things that are evolving. One of them being the ad hoc committee suggestions, ideas, recommendations, which they haven't been brought forward yet. And the other thing is about growth, specifically as it relates to whether or not we have space. And I just want to be clear and for our public, we currently don't have available space for any kind of growth, I'm assuming. And you can answer that, or the superintendent. I'm assuming that we don't, which is why Ms. Bolton is asking the questions about where those dollars might come from if and when we decide that we need to have dollars available. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yes, it makes sense. There are some schools that aren't as utilized as they could be. So there's space in our existing buildings. Now, whether they're in the right geographic spot or not is a different story. And so it's hard to answer that question in generalities. It'd be helpful to see a plan, and then we can strategize about the best way to make that happen.
Superintendent?
I will also add to that there are, just in some review with the team, there are some available locations that might be land that may be available, but in terms of trying to erect a school in that amount of space, it doesn't appear that that's something that we have at this time. And so to our treasurer's point, underutilization, yes, but just available properties right now in terms of where we are at cross-reference, it doesn't appear that we have that available.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Vice President Jones. We have a full evening. Any other last questions on the tax budget hearing? We're going to invite the public here in just a second. Ms. Bolton.
Gaining other revenue, I think, is the message I'm hearing. And that would also possibly include, and we need to know what the status of the law is, and it's come up in a couple of committees, the sale of our own property as well.
Was there a question you wanted to ask?
I tried to have an inflection there, but I was eating a Reese cup when I asked it, so it was kind of hard to get the inflection. But yes, is that a way of gaining revenue?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton.
Anytime.
Any other last from board members questions? And if not, we do have a hearing of public as a part of our tax budget hearing. Either Rob or Dan, do we have any folks online who have requested to speak? Okay, I understand we do have one comment I received at the beginning of the meeting, which is, I think, for the business meeting, and I will read it during the business meeting unless the folks here would like something different. And so I just want to check. Anybody else? We will have hearing of public again. Mrs. Sellers, would you like to come?
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and I hope everyone had a happy new year. I have two questions around this of building facilities. One is, can we access the TIF dollars for some of the part of the construction, especially like the parking lots and the roads and the driveways and all of that leading up to the building, for putting in like the water lines and utilities? Because, you know, they did add many more TIF districts just recently, and those dollars may not be accounted for. And then also, I know our city has land banked tons of properties all over the city, and we have lost all of those tax dollars from those land banked properties, because once it goes into the land bank, past property taxes become null and void, and nobody pays tax on any of those properties within the land bank. So we should be able to, since we've been losing money, access those properties that we could build a school. There's properties all over the city and tons of them on the west side. So those are two things I think that we need to look into, and that could help to eliminate some of the costs. And that's all.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. I'm not sure if the administration wants to respond at all to either the TIF or the land banking. I know we don't usually respond in hearing of the public, but our tax budget's a little different. Yeah.
Right. So we'll look into accessing the TIF dollars. The city collects that money, and it's their money. So we'll look into that. But in terms of the banked or evaded properties, the land bank properties, half of our property tax levy comes from fixed sum levies. We get the same value regardless of what happens with who's abated or not participating in the pool of payments. We'll still get our fixed sum levies. The fixed rate levies they're always adjusted for inflation, so I'm not sure what kind of impact that would have. Kevin would probably be a better answer that, but
I think as the values increase, and we will go through a triennial update or a reappraisal every 6 years, we have one or the other, and that'll happen next year. But for the ones that aren't fixed sum, that can generate a little bit more revenue on each of those continuing levies.
thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ashley, and thank you, Treasurer Wagner. So we're on our tax budget agenda. We have completed item C. We are now at item D, which is a resolution to approve the modified tax budget. Ms. Bolden, would you like to introduce that motion?
Yes, sir. This is a proposal, a resolution for the board, modified tax budget for the 2023-2024 fiscal year. Whereas the Cincinnati Board of Education held a public hearing, is this one that we're having right now, as is required by law. The tax budget format is as described by Hamilton County, which we have met. The purpose of the tax budget is to provide a basis for the Hamilton County Budget Commission review the district's tax rates and revenue for the general and bond and debt funds. And whereas the retirement of the bonded debt, 12 months, July 1st, 2023 to 24, bond retirement fund will be in the total amount, and it goes through the amount. And whereas we've met the stipulations that are required about meeting those amounts on the assurance of the treasurer and staff, I propose this resolution for consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Bolden. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Vice President Jones. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, Ms. Wagner, would you call the vote, please?
Ms. Bolton?
Aye.
Mr. Craig?
Yes.
Ms. Jones?
Yes.
Dr. Moffitt?
Yes.
Mr. Morosky?
Yes.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Yes.
President Lindy?
Yes. So we're going to, absent any objection, adjourn the first meeting, which is the tax budget hearing. No objections. That meeting is adjourned. We're going to continue now into our organizational meeting as soon as Rob